So over the past few weeks, we've talked a lot about many of the elements of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, but one of the things I've actually seen requested quite a bit related to the interior layout of a lot of the hallways and corridors on board, so I figured today we could take a look at the way some of the interior spaces of the vessel are laid out. I'm Colin, this is IS December, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. Before we begin, just a quick explanation. I do have a cold, so my voice may sound a little bit off this video, so I'm sorry in advance. So, a ship this massive needs a massive complement of troops and personnel to keep it up and running. And with the ship this big, how exactly do you lay out those personnel quarters? On one hand, it makes sense to put the quarters as close to their stations as possible. This sort of reduces the amount of time the crew members have to spend commuting from their bunks to their stations in the event of an emergency or just at the start of a on-shift time slot. But on the other hand, that would break up crew complements to stations around the ship and make it difficult to manage them in the event of a crisis. So, as a result, Kuat Drive Yards instead opted to have their barracks on board sort of set up in large clumps as opposed to scattered throughout the ship close to their stations. Now, before we get into what is where, I want to just throw out that if you haven't seen my video, mainly on the propulsion and the complement of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, I recommend watching those before this one because we're going to be working around a lot of those large propulsion elements and even some of the sort of hangar bay elements to discuss where these aspects of the ship are located. So let's start with the rank-and-file stormtroopers and enlisted Navy personnel, so basically the lowest ranks on board the vessel. Now, they would be bunked in sort of sections around the midsection of the ship in the primary hull. These sections were massive because the ship needed a massive complement of troops on board as well as personnel to keep this thing running. And these were in two large bays on either side of the ship's superstructure, on either side of its main propulsion, which sat deep within the ship's hull. They were outboard of the ship's primary turbolasers, which are these turbolasers on either side of the superstructure, and were in some of the most vulnerable parts of the ship, and quite frankly, it's because these crew members and embarked stormtroopers were viewed as ultimately expendable. And by the way, all of this is forward of the ship's sort of hangar bay and storage areas, which are all in this midsection of the ship, which, by the way, all of the mechanics for working on those vehicles would be included in this group and bunked in similar spaces on either side of the ship's primary hull. But in the center of the primary hull, near the stern of the vessel, is the ship's hypermatter reactor, as we discussed in the propulsion video, so much of these facilities had to work around that. And that's where the superstructure element comes in, which sits on top of the ship's primary engineering facilities. Now, this superstructure is dominated by quarters for officers, not the highest ranking officers who were quartered up here in the command tower, but many of the sort of smaller, lower ranked officers were bunked in this space in the ship's superstructure. These would, for example, be officers in charge of manning gunnery stations or managing operations in the hangar bays. These would not be the bridge officers commanding the entire vessel, who, like I said, would be bunked up here in the command tower. Also in this area would be things like armories, crew messes, and a detention center used for holding prisoners. Basically, a lot of what you consider for the inside of a Star Destroyer exists in this superstructure area up here. As we move after the superstructure, we get to the neck of the Star Destroyer, which connects the command tower to the rest of the vessel. That neck is primarily dominated by logistical capabilities needed to move things to and from this command tower, as well as many are familiar with, the ship's garbage dump, which dumps through a port in the back of the neck, as we see in Empire Strikes Back. And that brings us up to the command tower itself, which obviously contains the ship's bridge and a number of sort of command facilities like a war room for commanding ground operations, a CIC for commanding naval operations in the area, but it also houses many of the crew quarters for the highest ranking individuals on board, putting them as close to the bridge as possible, something that's actually a common design practice on modern naval vessels. Put the captain as close to the bridge and his deck officers as close to the bridge as possible, so in the event of an emergency, they're just a few rooms away from their command positions that they would need to be in to address said emergency. And all of this held true for both the Imperial 1 and the Imperial 2 class Star Destroyer, but it's also worth mentioning that a nearly identical layout was used on the Victory class Star Destroyer, so this became sort of a standard layout for Kuat Drive Yard wedge-shaped ships following the end of the Clone Wars. So, bunking this massive number of people on board is one of the key challenges of operating a vessel like this. If you'd like to learn about how they tackled some of the other challenges involved in maintaining a vessel this large, I'll leave a link up here to my playlist I'm building all about the anatomy of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer, which will include all of my IS December videos all in one place. So if you want to just dive into the sort of design of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, that's the place to do it. And if you have anything you'd like to see covered on future IS December videos, any other elements of this vessel you'd like to learn more about, you can leave those down in the comments, and I'll try my best to add them to the roster and cover them before the end of the month. And if you have anything outside of this about Star Wars or anything else in science fiction you'd like to see me cover in videos following the end of IS December, you can also leave those down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.